The first one is Ulrike is an old friend of mine. We go back, I don't know, the better part of a decade. Originally met at the BMW Foundation Transatlantic Forum and became rapid friends. And so when I heard from Johannes that she was coming to town, I was immediately all over this because I know of the intellectual firepower that Ulrike brings to the table alongside a very authentic, very congenial personality. So I'm very glad that she is here with us tonight. The second reason is, as Sean already alluded, oftentimes on the West Coast we forget that the relationship with Europe is actually still the most weighty in terms of trade and investment for the West Coast, even though we view ourselves and are viewed as very close and maybe by now closer to Asia. Certainly that's where much of the growth is, but the relationship with Europe is tremendously important, and as such our transatlantic relations and what's going on in Europe and how Europeans feel about those relations. So we're happy to have her here tonight. What I think we're going to do is we're going to give Ulrike the stage. As previous speakers have announced, she's very engaging. And then we will try to make this as interactive as possible. And I will try to moderate and facilitate, but I'm really more in the background and want to make sure that you all have a chance to converse with Ulrike. And so as such, I will try to tease on questions to spark a conversation. And the more we hear from you, the better the conversation will be. All right, so with that, I think where we're going to start is I'm going to ask Ulrike maybe to what we call lay the ground or the groundwork or touch on the meta level of transatlantic relations. How do Europeans feel about transatlantic relations? What are some of the key topic areas? And then we'll dive into some of those topic areas. All right, thank you very much, and let's give Ulrike a hand as she comes up.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's really my pleasure to be here. I'm the first time in San Francisco, the second time in San Francisco, and I really enjoy it. And I didn't come with flowers in my hair, but the sun was shining. I'm pleased to be one of the first Henry Kissinger stipends to do a 2 weeks travel through the United States. And I guess one of the reasons that the Bush Foundation actually is funding this, and the Bush Foundation is actually funding a lot of transatlantic activity these days, is probably because transatlantic relations aren't so well, and because they should perhaps be better. People need to invest. I shall start, or I plan to start with two very personal anecdotes, and but I think they are pretty sort of explicative. The one is that some 10 days ago I happened to be in a German radio show, SWR, Süddeutscher Rundfunk, which is a public radio of good quality. And I was talking about German international engagement, the new German global role, and so on and so forth. You know, the speech of our president, Mr. Gauck, Germany, more engagement, and so on and so forth. And listeners could dial in. And I was just speaking 5 minutes about, you know, Ukraine, Libya, whatever. I had the first people dialing in. And I went out after 1 hour, basically sweating, because I have never had so much blunt anti-Americanism in one radio hour than ever before in my life. It was basically, I'm sorry, I'm speaking in a mic, and F, so 3 dots, the US, NSA, they are spying us out, Putin is a strong man, so there was a real shift in the audience of sort of the US drove us to war, Iraq, Afghanistan, it's all crap, let's keep us out there, we don't need this any longer. And I was really struck. So I'm telling this because I just want to set the tone a little bit of what is happening apparently in sort of the mood or in the mindset of people. And basically on the other side of this new or not so new anti-Americanism, you have a really interesting in brackets complacency with Russia in the German audience. Complacency with Russia, with Ukraine, Crimea, we are going to talk about this. So the second anecdote is that if you see my father, me and my son, 23 years old, I want to make a point about generational dynamics also, which affects transatlantic relationship. And my father, who still get the chewing gums from the GIs, I'm born 64, which basically Adenauer, Germany, Cold War, you know, we never put into question transatlantic relations, European integrations are the two sides of the same medal, and this is the paradigm of German foreign policy, and the paradigm hold von Adenauer to Kohl, and it was basically not put into question for a second. My son, born first son 91, saw 1st March of 2003, the Iraq War, which basically was the first war, real live TV, which brought him from GameCube to reality, right? So his political socialization, the very fact that he would open a newspaper, was America is a very nasty nation that is in Iraq. And we happened to live in Berlin, and he was playing with a 9-year-old Russian friend who has a very nice GameCube and whatever. The thing here is, for my son, when he got into thinking, the Russians were nice and the Americans were really very bad. Yeah? That's very important because it's not only my son, it's a generation. And in 2006, when I suggested, coming from my thinking, that my son should go to high school, age 16, which I felt like was my childhood dream, he went literally pale and answered, "You want to send me to the US?" As if this is punishment. Huh? To give you this one, now he's really good off. Obama did the thing, and now he's just coming back from UCLA, so we put him back on track. But I'm saying this because emotions matter. Yeah? And these emotions are not my son only, this is measurable. If you look at the figures of transatlantic trends since 2003, whereas the sympathy curve from 0 to 100, which is how do you measure the sympathy from your country to another country, basically the country with the highest sympathy for the Germans is always France, but second were always the US. And in 2003, for the first time, the US had 51 percentage points and the Russians had 50. So in 2003, the peace dividend of 50 years of engagement of the United States and Europe, especially Germany, financial, political, emotional engagement, was 1 percentage point more than Russia, 2003. And it never recovered from there. This is measurable, and this is it. So, we are talking about the West and are we driving apart? So I just want to make a couple of points, sort of what is the West and what we are thinking about if we are talking the West. My first thesis here is the old West is gone. Beyond a little bit of pragmatism, and we are going to talk about this pragmatism, but the old West was a set of values, civil liberties, the best democracies, the world's hegemon, make the world a better place. If only Europe and the US would work together, the world is a better place. This paradigm does no longer hold today, and we are coming to this. NATO, defending freedom, whatever we priced into the old West. The West is a political or historical construct which holds 4989, and which you can argue is in derailment, in this disentanglement, derailment, or unravelment since 89. But it needed sort of 20 years of a generation to show this. Yeah. So it was an enforced policy movement from Adenauer. We know all the reasons. I go too much into it. But if we are looking at sort of today's trend, and I talked about the complacency with Russia, so be reminded, we had Stalinote, we had Herbert Wehner, we had Egon Bahr, we had always a sort of left national Sozialdemokratie in Germany. What is basically popping up today is not new. It is basically old patterns coming back. Yeah? Germany was in the East before it discovered 49-89 period, and the Americans were isolated before they discovered that they should care about Europe. Yeah? So the historical construct in a given period of time, 49-89, I think is very important. If you read through today's German newspapers, this is what basically the whole feuilletons are about, which is Germany has always been in the East. Yeah? Deutscher Orden, Katharinenburg, Katharina die Große, Wolga-Russen, Hitler, Stalin, you name it. Yeah? So I think there's something like history resonating, which is a feature of what we can see today. Robert Kagan wrote it already in his very marvelous book in 2003 when he said Mars, Venus, sort of Europe, and in the first sentence, time has come to realize that we do no longer understand each other. Yeah, this was the book in the early years of the last decade. And I think we are still in this sort of pattern. We need to come to grips with the fact or to realize that we do not really understand each other. So, this comes at a moment in time, and I think this is also very important, where both the EU and the United States are under deep strain. We have populism in Europe, you have Tea Party in the US, we have strain on our democracy, we have austerity, we have social crisis. These are features for Europe, but it puts political system largely under strain. I don't go much into it, but look at France, Marine Le Pen, and so on and so forth. So it's a sort of what I call, brackets, Weimarization of discourse. Yeah? The Weimarization of discourse is that on the left side you have anti-Fed, anti-Americans, anti-banks, anti-capitalism, and on the right you have godfatherhood, religion, Putin, Marine Le Pen, La République. So, but it's basically also in terms of semantics, who is alert in these days, reading newspapers, you find a very different vocabulary on how we discuss things. Yeah? And I think this is important. And the US has its own problems. I'm not supposed to talk about domestic problems of the US, but strain on democracy, it's on me telling me this. Elizabeth Warren, Al Gore, Stiglitz, I mean a couple of people out there which are basically also making the case that the US is beyond reformability and beyond the capacity to reform big data, big government, and so on and so forth. I don't want to detail, but we have societies under strain on both sides of the Atlantic. And now in the middle of this strain comes the next sort of paradigm shift, which is China emerging and so on and so forth. And oops, we discover perhaps we should get closer again. And that's where now, under the guidance of Olaf, I want to touch about the 3 points, which is TTIP, Ukraine, and NSA, which are three tricky topics where basically we have problems in all of them, figuring them out. But if there's one sort of meta trend, what I see in these things is that because we are in societal breakups or in domestic problems on each side, because there's this global shift, Asia and China and so on and so forth, the idea that we could basically revamp the West through an institutional arrangement called TTIP on the one side, and through Let's Stand United on the Ukraine thing, I think is the theme which runs through the two. Sorry. So the TTIP thing, I think, is a pretty smart idea to institutionalize a relationship which has been institutionally channeled through NATO alone, and NATO is no longer it. Yeah? Because of many things of European defense and all of this, but you need also different institutional channels. So it comes now, and we may wonder for a second why it comes now, because that's not the first time that we're talking about a transatlantic marketplace and let's do this tariff regulation, so on and so forth. We started the first transatlantic business dialogue transatlantically in '95. We had in 2006 another slot open where Germany, which the presidency wanted to transatlantic marketplace. So we are on this agenda basically since nearly 20 years, and never it saw the daylight. Never we got the political energy together to really do the thing. Now, China, WTO more or less deadlocked after a comprehensive agenda failed. And this emergence, probably Ukraine, the whole thing together, we need something like the reinvention of the West, both in terms of set of values, economic channel, and strategic rethinking. Yeah? And I think the themes we are going to talk about are essentially this temptation. Whether this temptation, this will hold, is the big question, because perhaps we are in a big discrepancy gap about what are our intentions and what we can deliver. But this is now for discussion, so I'll move over to the chair, and I'm under the control of Olaf's questions, but before perhaps giving you a conclusion, which I didn't not yet sort of do. That the US administration had decided we need this TTIP, I think, was basically spring 2013, and then the agenda was really crashed through. In the mandate was negotiated in very short time. Yeah, you remember. So we all know that the time frame is extremely tight for a big transatlantic negotiation. The mandate is running out with Obama's term. So I think that was the driving force. Euro crisis, American recession. Obama needed some success. Plus emergence of China, and it all together, and now we do it, and it was prepared because, again, we weren't speaking about it for the first time. Yeah, we had this transatlantic marketplace since so long on the table, and it never triggered. Yeah.
Why don't you keep it? The follow-on question here would be, but isn't this sort of a partnership between two sick people? Two sick people don't make a healthy person, right? We have America that's struggling with its own, as you say, systems issues in democracy and finance and business. We've got Europe in crisis, or slowly coming out of crisis. Here we are now reacting knee-jerk to these crises, to the threat of much larger growth and possibly political weight in Asia. In your opinion, is this the solution?
Well, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, and we don't know whether we get it this time, because if I'm not mistaken, there's not yet a fast track in the US. The European Parliament needs to decide. I mean, I think TTIP today looks better than 3 months ago, looks better than 6 months ago. I think we were in deep trouble a couple of months ago because we had, the Europeans were in the process of consultations of stakeholders and realized how big is the resistance. Yeah, we are a little bit over this process because the European Union, I think, has been largely performing in getting that stakeholder implementation assessment and so getting it right and binding these NGOs into the process. But believe me, the protest in Europe is really large. And not only against the claw chicken and these things, but investment clause is the single biggest important thing, just because the fear, rightly and wrongly we can discuss, but the fear that it's torpedoing European concepts of culture, yeah, like Google suing against Buchpreisbindung, for instance, or Amazon suing against Buchpreisbindung, and that through investment clause processes, you torpedo basically a whole structure of intellectual price binding, for instance. These are huge fears, and they are vastly shared, from opera people to movie people to book people to the whole intelligentsia, let alone the French with exception culturelle, and that every member state needs to decides at the end, the European Parliament and the member states. So anyway, I think, is this the right answer? The question is, we are now allowing a lot of trouble, and we are doing a lot of hedging of administration, stakeholder consultations, and so on and so forth, for a thing which value might be above all and beyond the economic gain, which is 0.5%, 500 euros per capita per year per European is the estimate. Yeah. So is this big or is this not big? Let's see, right? But beyond the economic gain, and a little bit on tariffs and a lot on non-tariffian barriers, so there's something in, but it's a lot of stress. But I think what really matters is two things. First, the strategic dynamism, the West united. That's my core argument, sort of redynamizing the West and brackets show it to China. Yeah, yes, we can. The West functions. We have a concept for the West. There is something, yeah, which is we need to re-dynamize this, yeah, at a time where German-Chinese export business functions marvelously well, yeah. So this, and is it the right? So this could be the argument for yes, it is the right answer because that's what we want to achieve. And the other, it might not be the right answer, is perhaps the West is torpedoing the system it built itself in the last century. Because this Meistbegünstigungsklausel,
MFN status, most favored nation status.
The third country issue is a really big issue here. Yeah? And basically we are destroying is too hard as a word, but we are affecting the multilateral order that we built once and on which we were basically most relying on. Yeah. So if you are Canada and you lose 10% of your GDP, or you are Turkey and you sit on that third country perspective from TTIP, you actually do not like it, and for reason. Yeah. So I think there is a half positive and a half negative answer. Sort of, is TTIP the right answer?
Yeah. Do you think? We discussed over dinner that this could be an attack on multilateralism. But being a realist, couldn't you say, well, with the Doha round floundering, couldn't this be a stepping stone toward a multilateral system? Aren't we just being realistic that you can't bite off too much at once? If it doesn't work to have a global system, why not start with two very big blocks?
That's what we say.
That's what we say.
That's what we say. So, was ich weiß das englische Wort für schönreden nicht.
Where it's a bit of a window dressing.
Yeah. So it's not only window dressing. I mean, obviously there's a hope that you get a multilateral agenda out of a bilateral engagement. Yeah. But I mean, for the thing is, what this hope, and we convey that this might be it, and we are just basically not betraying that's in all the official statements that you read. Yeah, the first thing you read is no, we do not harm to the multilateral. So the thing is, even if it's a gate open process, which is that we do TTIP and we let others in, which is sort of we are bridge building for third countries to come in, and there are a lot of clauses it's anticipated. Yeah, but what it means is they can come in, but we set the rules. And it's a very different proceeding from negotiating the rules in a multilateral. I mean, that's in the first place why cooperation agenda in Seattle broke down. It was too complicated. But here you go, which is a sort of Western dominance thing, which is we negotiate that thing. We are gentle to the others. We allow them to come, gate open, obviously. But the rule-setting agency, that's us. Yeah? So do the others like this? I don't know. Will they respect it? Probably yes, because we don't leave them another choice. And then after we could sell it as a, yes, we multilateralize, everybody's on board now. Yeah, but I think it's a very tricky thing here.
Yeah, okay. Before we open up, maybe I'll tie the other two topics that we briefly touched on, or you briefly touched on earlier, together. And that is Europe's opinions about the NSA scandal and the current developments around Ukraine and Russia. You said that your son grew up in a world in which there was very little difference in terms of public perception between the perception of Russia and the perception of the United States. Has that changed at all now with what Putin is doing in Ukraine? And the follow-on question would be, if there is bad in the East and bad in the West, where does that leave us?
Well, I don't know, but I'm basically coming from European integration research, and what I experience most in this new narrative for Europe, blah blah blah, and why can't we get our act together, is generational dynamics. In Europe now, when you are teaching and you have the 20-year-old kids and you ask them who's Jacques Delors, they don't know. Yeah? And I'm talking about kids from Bucerius Law School, where the daughters and sons of the wealthy part of Hamburg are studying law. I'm not talking of a Kfz-Mechaniker in Thüringen. Yeah? And these 20-year-olds do not know what is the Maastricht Treaty and do not know what is the law. Why am I saying this? Because for transatlantic relation, although I haven't looked into the figures, but it's probably the same thing. Yeah, you grow in a generational dynamic, something like 20 years. So don't tell me that once upon a time GIs gave chewing gum and it's over. And I tried to give you some data for this, but with respect to Putin, not that Putin is the sort of very nice guy. Yeah, I mean, although he's a crystal clear Democrat, as we learned, he is not perceived as being nasty. Yeah, because I mean, he didn't do a war, for instance, but the US did. I mean, if you reason in very simple things, I mean, I'm not saying that Putin is a hero or nice or that everybody loves Putin, but again, I told you that there is something like in Germany we have this new word now, which is Putin-Versteher. Yeah, the people who understand Putin, because Crimea was always Russian. So I mean, we should leave this to him. Yeah, and then we have a discourse which is not a American discourse, because the American discourse, and I listened carefully to Brzezinski and Scowcroft and a couple of other people in Washington in March. But the little tendency of the US semantics about the whole Ukraine thing, which is very easy, go back before '89. Yeah. The US, then we told you that you cannot live with the Russians. Yeah, had you believed me. Yeah, I mean this, the image of Russia is still Soviet image driven in the US intelligentsia. Yeah, because it's still Brzezinski around. Yeah, he's super smart, but you understand what I mean. He's also tagged by his historical before '89. So yeah. So in Germany and in Europe, this is really different. First, because we do all this stuff that the US never understands. Multilateral consensus, intertwinement, just an approach of policies which is intuitively not American, because not clear-cut. Yeah? It's called agreements and accessions and institution building, and it's just complex and complicated, and it lasts forever, and it's sort of not conveyable to what the US thinks, yeah, and on Ukraine, I think these things get mixed up. What I want to say is the Putin-Versteher benefit from this peace image of the European Union, which is also that. How shall I say this? That if you look in liberal green spectrums in the Greens, yeah, you have now a competition between freedom for peace or both. Yeah, what tops what? Does peace top freedom, or does freedom top peace? Yeah, and we are. You understand what I mean with mixing up? Yeah, because we had a rhetoric in the so-called Cold War, where if you read CDU, Adenauer, Kohl sort of speeches, Es war immer Frieden und Freiheit, Frieden und Freiheit, yeah? And now we are basically getting into gray zones, which is, don't die for Crimea, yeah? I mean, we heard all Obama in Warsaw speaking, yeah? But again, we are beyond that clear-cut rhetoric that we once had, and there's a lot of amalgamation between business interests, EU potentials, new Putin Versteher, different generations, and so on and so forth. So, and with this, having said all this, I'm not saying that nothing is happening. There's a lot of I'm basically convinced that the European Union got this Ukraine crisis so far rather well. At least we didn't stumble about disunity, which for the European Union is a lot. Yeah, I mean, Syria, Libya, yeah. So this time we were united, not saying that we didn't dispute between the East and the more Western countries, Radek, Sikorski, Carl Bildt, and the Germans perhaps, but I'm profoundly convinced that Steinmeier does a fantastic job in moderating the US and the European interest, but also the more Eastern, Baltic, Northern interest with the West European interest on Ukraine, and that we did this Weimarer triangle from Poland to Berlin to Paris, and that as a whole, the European Union stood united on Ukraine.
Let me push you a little bit on this. There are some voices, notably some Austrian friends, who say, isn't this the Anschluss all over again? Why are we not opposing Mr. Putin now? Why are we yet again thinking that we can essentially negotiate with a dictator? Didn't we negotiate in the 30s and 40s when we really should have put a stop to it then? So to an American ear hearing that, that sounds quite reasonable. What is Europe's plan? What's the end game? If we don't oppose him, how do we think this is going to play out? Where is Putin going to take this? And how are we going to deal with him if we don't oppose him?
And what's the US plan?
Right.
Yeah? Because, I mean, I know that the, say, US American or US, for the sake, German, yeah, division here is, I wouldn't say huge, but visible, yeah. And the US blame game on Germany, yeah, Gazprom connection and so on and so forth. At least when I was in Washington in March, was really loud, yeah. The US were very easy and quick to criticize, especially Germany. And it's true that Germany has the tipping point position here because Germany unites Europe on this question. That's evident. You don't do a thing against or without Germany. But here's the thing. The US is not engaged. No gas dependency, no industry engaged. We are in a very different setting. An industry engagement that is not only Siemens. This is the whole German Mittelstand. 600 companies delivering, I don't know what, into Russia. Siemens is 160 years business tradition. I talked to people from European Investment Bank, London, yeah, who basically said in terms of the sanctions, don't let it go to industrial sanctions because the moment the industrial relationship we have with Russia is the only relationship left. If we reason in rebuilding institutional ties with Russia because we do not want to let it go with a sort of cutting, yeah, then we need something, and industrial relations could be it. Obviously, that's a German argument. On Crimea, yes, I mean, we do hold the US has a policy language, we should, but it's pretty much a we should and you don't do it neither language, if I may say this, right? The Europeans have a pretty legal discussion, and nobody, establishment or serious in Germany, is actually saying that this was that we should, is. I mean, nobody is sanctioning the Crimea annexion officially in Germany. Yeah, I was just pointing to a complacency on the level of citizens with a respect to a rhetoric of the establishment, which is really distinct. Yeah? So we make a legal case about Crimea, we make a legal case about annexion, but at the end of the day, obviously we are all a little bit puzzled. What should we do? And now we have some troops more in Poland. Obviously the Poles are more concerned than the Germans. The Germans are a little bit on this die Russen sind immer nett zu uns, sort of thing. There is a problem with different fear perception with respect to Russia. This is evident within the European Union. But on the other hand, basically your question points to red lines, which is which red line do we draw when, yeah? And if I may say, the US tried red lines with Iran, and they never worked. And we are trying red lines with Syria, and they never worked. And we better don't try red lines with Ukraine. This is a little bit the problem, because what is happening now, I think what divides us here is that the US is too much reasoning about red line approaches, and Europe is not about red line approaches, because we see that there's no red line possible. What the European problem is that we see a completely slow but lasting destabilization of the eastern part of Ukraine, which at no moment will trigger war, because it's, you know, all these towns in eastern Ukraine, yeah? At no point there will be, I think, there will be just a trigger, which is then the trigger, yeah? But lasting destabilization is the best that fuels him Putin's hand. And this is what gives him so much leverage. Yeah, because you're faced with a situation where he has basically a hand on a federalization and fragmentation of the eastern parts of Ukraine, which is so slowly, is so sublimated and subcutaneous that at no point you will really react with sharp measures. Yeah, and so what's your question about can we let it go and when should we stop it? Yeah, I think there's much more like an inertia underway, and this is the concern for Europe, because here we do not really know which answers we should provide. Now we are providing answers since the Ukrainian elections. We are again on EU association agreement, paying the gas bill and so. So I think the Europeans basically come to grips, and this is also the truth for the European side. We overpromised with the association agreement. We made mistakes. We didn't back this with money when it happened all in Maidan. And now I think we are tirer les leçons. We are getting the lesson that now we do association agreement, we do it for real, and we back it with money. I think this is the consequence that Europe is now drawing.
Okay, great. Questions from the audience, please. The gentleman in the back, yes.
From way in the back. I think it was mentioned that you're a very engaging speaker. Yes, you are. I think I listened to you. I heard every single word you mentioned. When you were speaking on that program that you were talking about in Germany, when you walked out exhausted from all the comments you were hearing, particularly the anti-American comments, did you take the opportunity there at any time to do what we call here, make it a teachable moment? One thing that comes to mind for me is that if people in Europe are making anti-American comments, the United States is so diverse. The languages, the difference between the state of Massachusetts and the difference between the state of California is tremendous. I've traveled almost all over the United States, and it's very different. Even the governments, the national government is one thing, state governments totally different, local governments very different. So my question is, did you at all try to enlighten any one of the questioners on that program?
Yeah, obviously. I mean,
well, I didn't get that.
You do some pedagogy it was just interesting in which density it came. Yeah, and it was a public radio. You know, not a. You see my point. So you would have expected a more instructed audience. I was honestly just surprised by the words chosen and by the openness of this not even sublimated anti-Americanism. Yeah, it just like a breakout of so many people which you had in that one radio. I don't want to make an empiry out of it. This is no empirical data. But you can measure in online portals on Ukraine today that there's just something changing. And what is changing, this is, you know, we thought that politics is about rational choice. It's not. Politics is about emotions, right? And these subtle changes also in the words we use and how you talk, just Putin-Versteher, you know? We didn't have Brezhnev-Versteher, yeah? So these are changes, and I just want to point to these changes, and I was just puzzled in this. That's why I, in this radio session, this is why I started with it.
Does this all go back to NSA? I mean, obviously, you know, the Bush wars, but then where obviously Germany had heavy disagreements with the American administration, and now NSA. Is this sort of like the sequence of disagreements, or what's hardening it?
Well, I know that these things don't compare, and obviously the comparison is completely wrong. But I remember quite well that after 9/11, whenever you did transatlantic discussions, what the Americans tried to say is you completely underestimate, yeah, because then you had all this legislation and homeland security and so, and the Europeans would find this exaggerated, and then the American answer was always, you underestimate what it did to us, yeah. And I think it's a little bit the same, although again, nothing compares. But I think the US underestimates. Yeah. There is obviously, France is not Germany, it's not the UK. Germany is especially sensitive. Why is Germany especially sensitive? We had the Nazis and we had Stasi. We have two spying regimes which draw us, yeah. So this is really, we are the country which has all this legislation which you do not find in the Bill of Rights. We have Grundgesetz, which is about Recht auf informatielle Selbstbestimmung in '86, when the Karlsruhe came up first with a legislation on the right to master your data in an Informationszeitalter, in the age of cyber technology. We have privacy spheres, which is different. If you go through the first 20 articles of the Grundgesetz, dignity of these articles are all differently framed than the freedom articles of the Bill of Rights. So there are different sensitivities, and this is probably worth a lecture about 150 years of Ideengeschichte, history of ideas, and why you end up in their specific terms. But it's particularly sensitive for Germany. And if you take this very recent EuGH-Urteil, the European Court on Google and the right to delete your data, yeah, which basically now makes a global distinction between US and European citizenships, in the sense that European citizens have the right to go to Google and to delete the data, and you have not. And then the question is, what do the Americans will make out of this? Will you go to court? Will there be somebody here who goes to court who says, if the European can delete the Google data, then perhaps ask me as an American? So there are very different sensitivities here. But don't underestimate not only the engagement of the EuGH. Everybody was really much welcoming this EuGH-Urteil. For us, this is really bringing down big data. Do not underestimate the German saliency to develop hardware technology, this cyber initiative. German money to have a cyber industry sort of master plan now, which could be German or /European. And don't underestimate the Merkel cell phone effect. Yeah? I happen to know the guy who is running the Untersuchungsausschuss, this special committee which we had on the Snowden affairs, yeah? Who's a friend of mine, Mr. Kiesewetter. And he told me that the documents that the committee got, 100,000 pages, out of which 10,000 said to be very sensitive, yeah, they are blacked, yeah. There is, for what we call Untersuchungsausschuss, which should be the scrutiny control of what have happened, it is basically inconceivable that this is not open, that somebody went and blacked out things, yeah. So who's the somebody, yeah? Don't give you the answer, because you know it, and because Merkel was in the US before. We don't get Snowden. So there's a huge discussion in Germany, realizing that this Untersuchungsausschuss will not have the clout we wanted it to have, because we are not able to bring Snowden to Germany, we are not able to interview him in Moscow, security problems, this and that. We had weeks, and you wouldn't imagine, but we had weeks where Snowden and this Untersuchungsausschuss, yeah, was front page news and front page first radio news when you open any radio. So yes, I think most of this, or probably it was the drop too much after Afghanistan, after Iraq, after Homeland Security, after Bush, after, because the list is long. And that was probably the thing too much in a given moment of time, where what has been bubbling below surface now comes up.
The gentleman in front, yeah.
Just to comment on the last thing you said, maybe the last straw, because the Bush invasion of Iraq was him, whereas this seems like us. The eavesdropping seems like us rather than just, you know. But the question I want to ask is this. Regarding Ukraine, can you consider the possibility that Putin has backed himself into a corner rather than vice versa, and that he's been reacting rather than following a grand strategy? And just a couple of points along that line. When he took Crimea, that eliminated the possibility of a pro-Russian government getting elected in Ukraine forever. And secondly, instability isn't always such a wonderful thing for somebody who's selling something, who's interested in money.
Look, I mean, we are not yet done with Ukraine, and I don't have a crystal ball here, and it's a little hard to say who is sort of behind the curve and who serves the curve between Putin. And I think we are doing better now, to be honest. I think the West, the West in brackets, meaning the US, and Europe, are better performing since the Ukraine election, since Obama spoke in Warsaw, since we are, we sent some troops to Poland. We were more affirmative action in a way in what we do, more resoluteness also in we don't let it go, clear words. So I think, and again, the European Union did not split. I mean, perhaps this sounds ridiculous to you, but the European Union did not split on Ukraine. This is massively big and huge and wonderful, yeah? I mean, for what it is, and for all these disputes on Ukraine that you could have between Poland and, say, Italy, yeah, or Portugal and Germany, or whatever, yeah? The very fact that we stood together and stand together is hugely important. It could boost European foreign policy. It could boost European energy policy, because of this energy dependency now there are really initiatives that we are reducing, I mean that we are pushing for more integrative energy policy in the whole compact of, reducing gas dependency from Russia, building up relationships with other gas partners, but also doing a couple of initiatives on renewables and so on and so forth. So this is good for the European Union, yeah? Is Putin, has he the stronger sort of, is he strategically weak or not? Probably he ran the game for a couple of weeks and months, I would argue, when he took Crimea and we didn't react, and when he started to mix up the eastern part of Ukraine and we had little hold. And this is a sort of slow dismantling strategy of federalization and getting bits and pieces here of eastern Ukraine. And you do not really want to answer, yeah, because none of this has been too massive. I mean, it escalated a little bit, but we were clear also we wouldn't go to war, yeah. I mean, the West, yeah.
I guess what I was really wondering is whether he was pushed into this as much as he wanted it, because of the Russian nationalism in eastern Ukraine and Crimea.
Yeah. So. I am personally, I mean, I'm not a governmental official. Thomas Bagay, if you have him here in a couple of weeks, then he can tell you he's much more important than I, and he is in the Auswärtiges Amt Planungsstab. So I have personally no problems to admit that the European Union committed mistakes, yeah, in pushing this association agreement probably a little bit too quickly, in not being sensitive at potential Russian reactions, yeah. In not pricing them in, or in perhaps even thinking that we could do this without a Russian reaction. Yeah? Call it naive, call it not good analysis, but probably there was something, and I don't say names, but I've been talking to one of the foreign ministers who's now no longer foreign minister, but who has been foreign minister and left the council in. Anyway, and she experienced a couple of foreign minister debates, and it was really, there was a clear sort of northern drive for this accession agreement, Maidan, let's do it now, yeah? And call it naive, call it, I wouldn't even say there was a big game like chessbook, Brzezinski, now we take Ukraine. Probably not. The EU is much too less interested in power to have thinkings like this. Yeah? But, So, and we didn't, the moment we did this with the association agreement, we didn't back it by money, yeah? So we left the Maidan alone. And then we had a couple of, we nurtured this Maidan freedom thing, but then the events in Maidan also escalated in a way that nobody could have seen. And we had, the time we needed to figure out who drives Maidan and which forces are there. These were very complicated times from October to February, right? So then came the elections, then came this Crimea referendum, and what to say? I mean, the only thing I remember is that German press was, how to say, between the right of self-determination and the right of territorial integrity. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying this referendum was legal or, we have all the problems of this referenda, which wasn't under the conditions we would say that this was a fair referenda, but again, we let it go. So I think until then, until probably May or so, Putin was driving the West. Yeah. And was he victimized is the interesting question. Sort of, did he need, I think, yeah? I mean, this is where the Putin-Versteher argument comes from, yeah? The moment you say, sort of, could Putin just look at this and let go, is the same that the question that we are posing, which is, can we look at this and let it go, right? And I think we are honestly not done with providing an answer other than nobody wants war, other than we live on the same continent, other than we need to figure out something that rebuilds something, yeah? Because, and that's where more the transatlantic divide is probably bigger than the inner European divide, yeah, on this question, so.
Okay, we had questions over here, yes, please.
For the second part of the title, which was between disintegration and dismantlement of Europe around those crises, do you see this as a crisis resolution building process for the European Union, while within Europe actually there is a variety of support for the US and for, if we take for example Russia in the case of Ukraine, because as the same way Germany, for example, have affinity of Russia, the UK, for example, have a lot of affinity for the US, and same, for example, for Holland. So is it something which is really a crisis within Europe also, a crisis resolution which is building for a bigger European integration?
Well, Europe is in trouble, yeah, and there's this little Euro crisis and banking union and little EP elections and populism, so let's skip all this, right? If you ask me whether the Ukraine crisis has a more uniting or more disuniting effect, I argue it has a more uniting effect on Europe. A more uniting effect in terms of European foreign policy, a more uniting effect in terms of European energy policy, and again, the very fact that the European Union didn't split on Ukraine is just much.
It's the same for NSA. Because after NSA, they had in the parliament also votes on privacy, European privacy laws and things like that. So that's why I was asking for three of them.
Yeah, okay. Just 1 second back on EU-Russia relations too. Yeah, I mean, this is the question that we had. Basically, is Russia now isolated? Yes, it is. It will be politically punished. It has been punished. It has been excluded of the G8. We have been pretty tough. We have been tough on the first range of sanctions, the financial sanctions, freezing. So there's a lot going on, which is, and I do not, with all the features that I spelled out on the intertwinement and the European complexity of policy approaches and everything, but there is also, to just state this once very clearly, there is a clear understanding in Europe too that this has been a game-changing moment, and that Putin must also be clearly told that he broke the rules of international engagement, of international relations, of the way we dealt with him, and then he's no longer sort of a part of, I wouldn't say of the West, but remember the Russians were in the NATO Russia Council and so on and so forth. So we are talking about, again, let this overflow. We are talking about a paradigm change to some extent, which is how to deal with Russia, yeah? But you will not be able to exclude exclude Russia because Russia is much too important in a way, even if fragilized economically, even if this country is destabilized, demography is bad, and I mean, it's so easy to point to all the weaknesses of Russia in the midterm, yeah, but in the immediate term, Russia is not so weak. There's also Syria, there's also Iran, and so on and so forth. So you look at the global map, Russia cannot be not a partner basta. This is too short, yeah, because the Russian leverages are elsewhere in the system. So yes, on the NSA thing, like with the SWIFT agreement in 2009, like with everything, the moment the US stresses us too much, we tend to unite. Yeah, EU data protection, NSA, SWIFT agreement, banking transfers, the moment where the EP had the moment of we are Congress, we can become Congress, was the SWIFT agreement, I think in 2009, right? When the US wanted the data, the banking data of European citizens flying over, and the European Parliament said no. I think we had another sort of big moment with the EuGH. This time it was the court. Be remembered that the two institutions driving European integration are, as much as in the history of the United States, are pretty much the federal court. I mean, our federal court, so the European Court and the Parliament and ECB. Yeah, so it's pretty much. I mean, you can see analogies to what it has been over 150 years in the US. So the court, the Parliament, and our bank ECB are driving integration, and each time, either that's Iraq or Blixen or SWIFT or what have you, yeah, NSA, you have the ambivalence of transatlantic relation is always that if the US overstretches it, you get a European answer of autonomy, yeah, yeah.
But wouldn't you say there are some very notable and very important exceptions, right? So we remember after the Iraq War, Poland was America's new darling in Europe.
Mm-hmm. And changed after
and that changed, right? Changed very quickly.
Spain too.
Spain too. And now we're looking at the UK, essentially threatening to quit and to split, and obviously in the NSA affair they were more on the side of the Americans, and now we're looking at governance trouble, the financial system, and now very clear words from the British Prime Minister toward Putin. I mean, you do see, and you could argue that split has always been there, it's just being exaggerated, but you do see around the fringes, you see very important partners that are not quite united now, are they, with us, with Europe?
Well, I mean, divide et impera is a very good game to play with the European Union, and it's not only the US who plays this, but China and Russia know very well how to play the divide et impera game with the European Union. Yeah, and it's the weakness of the European Union to very often not be able to correspond to this or to answer to this. And the US is a particularly sort of interesting case here because every country every member state of the European Union loves the US so much that every member state of the EU thinks that it has a special relationship to the US, which is definitely the case for Germany, but also for the Brits, definitely the case for Poland, but also for the Dutch, definitely the case for the Lithuanians, and I can go down. Yeah, you wouldn't find any member states of the European Union who wouldn't think intuitively that perhaps Malta, but who thinks that we have that special relationship with the US, right? And that is where this whole ambivalence comes from, that because this is so, there is a tacit rhetoric which is doing something against the US never works in Europe. Yeah, you always need to do it with the US, and rightly so, because that's why we sit here and discuss transatlantic relations. On the other hand, we see all these trigger points where, be it Google, EuGH, SWIFT agreement, where there are some cases where we have intuitively this feeling that here on the set of values, like TTIP, like the investment clause, like what I said about the cultural exception here, where there is always this balance to strive between, we don't do this against the US, but here we are Europeans and we stand together because we simply feel differently. Yeah? And this is emerging and can be triggered. Yeah? And there are a lot of triggers in this TTIP. Yeah? Or all TTIP is about these triggers. Yeah? Claw chicken and hormone beef and I mean, yeah, you can wonder why in this, what is this 14 marketplace, San Francisco, where's the whole organic market full of non-hormone beef, and you are proud of having your market with non-hormone beef, but on the negotiation for, apparently there's also little sensitivity in this country that it might not be so good. Yeah, so the question is, where does this come from, and why these much emotional themes then trigger these feelings of Europeans that we are closer among each other than in a transatlantic setting.
Yeah, it's interesting, because at the same time you could argue that America is not uniting, America is splitting, as we talk about red and blue, and as we talk about the coasts versus everything else. Interesting dynamic. There was a gentleman in the back. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your interesting exposition. I'd like to make some comments and someone ask questions, and hope we can trigger some, I think it's going to trigger some reaction from you. If I understood you correctly, you're saying now, today, European-American relations are very bad because of NSA, Ukraine, and etc. I had the good fortune of working in Germany 30 years ago, and I think that at that time the Americans wanted to, I think they did deploy the Pershing II and cruise missiles against the Soviet Union. At that time, I served in Germany. I got to know members of the Green Party, the SPD, CDU, etc. My impression at that time was that people really felt the deployment of those missiles, American missiles and Soviet missiles, would possibly lead to war. Today we have a situation where, we got Angela Merkel's phone was tapped apparently, and other issues, Google and that. But even over Ukraine, it was clear nobody's going to go to war with Ukraine. Today I'm quite an optimist. I don't think in today's world either the leaders of Russia or China, Russia and China are now being depicted as outside the system. Today's Russian leaders are not Soviet leaders. The Soviet leaders, we all know, and I had contacts with the Soviet embassy 30 years ago, they were different. They lived in their own ideological shell.
Yeah, but
today, the Russian and Chinese leaders, they've tasted the fruits of the West, of the whole world, so nobody's interested in war. But my point is basically this. I think we have painted rather dustra, a very gloomy picture of European-American relations. I think the deployment of the cruise missiles and Pershing II, that was really more serious than today's issues. And yet, European relationship or German-American relations overcome them. Of course, you can say it's a different generation, it's 30 years ago. And the people at that time in the 80s, Kohl and Schmidt were the chancellors, they remembered the war. Today's leaders, Angela Merkel was not even born at the time. But still, fact is, in my opinion, I'm an outside observer, I don't think the relationship between the US and Europe is that bad as it was 30 years ago. Second point I'd like to make, you're talking about China, you're saying the TTIP, also, if I understood you correctly, the TTIP could be a reaction to the rise of China. Actually, in our view in Asia, China is a factor we cannot, just like Russia, dismiss. China is a factor whether we like it or not. The Chinese see the world, of course, differently. They see the Western-dominated world, but we don't think the Chinese are out to destabilize this Western-dominated world, because they have been benefiting from it. Like I said, we think the Chinese leaders, Chinese students, there's so many Chinese here, they see what the West, so-called West, can offer, and they are not, in our opinion, out to, if I may be, use a crude word, screw you. So I think if you say that TTIP is in reaction to that, then it's strange. One more last comment. In East Asia, the Americans are also negotiating with the rest of East Asia in the TPP. China is not in the TPP so far. Who knows, it may come in. So the TPP is also one way of America to engage with the rest of the Asia Pacific. And so we don't see it as I don't see it as a reaction to the fact that China is outside the system, Russia is over Ukraine. It's more, to us, it's more about economics, it's more about jobs, it's more about creating jobs for all.
Well, and I think if I understood Ulrike correctly, she wasn't saying that we're afraid of China from a military security angle. I think what she was saying is there's a certain element of realpolitik here, which is understandable. China is a heavyweight, a global heavyweight, economically. So why not combine forces to have a voice, right? If I understood you correctly.
I mean, first, I didn't want to paint a gloomy picture of transatlantic relations. What I said, I think there's a strong generational dynamics. Yeah? There is a strong factor of historical illiteracy. Yeah. And basically, I was saying that we try now with TTIP and with Ukraine to revamp the West in institutional and in economic terms. Yeah, whether we succeed is a different story. Whether we are basically credible in what we do, whether there is a gap between our intentions and reality, are different questions. But the attempt that we do a sort of West Web 0.2 or West 2.0 or 3.0, right? That we are trying to build a different sort of West for the 21st century, yeah? For the better or for the worse. So with China, I think the only answer here is geoeconomics tops geostrategy. We are no longer in a geostrategic world. This is why the Pershing example works and doesn't work, because the paradigms are completely shifting. We are in a mercantile setting. We are putting the feature of the West was that we would have the strong set of values combined with the biggest transatlantic market. Today, this is it's a disentanglement between the economic partner, yeah, like Germany, China, where you do no longer request that your best or biggest economic partner is also your best value and strategic partner. This is the disentanglement that we do, yeah? And so we are going in a mercantile world, or we are going in a economic tops everything world. I mean, these are different discussions, but there is the Piketty book and everything on the market, which is, there are a couple of meta themes here. And the real question for the transatlantic relationship tomorrow, and that's what I mean, is, are we coping these answers together? Are we providing the same answers between the US and Europe to these geo-economic answers? Then we were able to provide the same answers to a geostrategy setting. What I mean is, because you talked about I think the driving force, and let's make this sentence, I think we will stop soon talking about transatlantic and Europe and Germany and the US, because the real division lines, who said it here in the room, yeah, is rural, urban, and that is so overflight country in the US as this is so in Germany or in France. I can give you a class of political economy why the rural-urban divide in France drives Marine Le Pen. Yeah. So and then we are talking different meta things for the decade to come or for the century to come, which is mega cities, which is rural-urban divides, which is what I call Singaporeization. Everybody wants ownership, but nobody wants stakeholdership in the world, in the global system, and so on and so forth. Yeah, and I think the real question is when we will quit in the transatlantic relationship this classical framing. And basically provide answers, common answers to these new meta trends. I think this is the challenge. Yeah.
I think it's certainly true that you're seeing a business elite certainly evolving, and we have one of my students in the room, in fact, a classic example. I tell these guys you will have more in common with your brothers and sisters in Berlin and Hong Kong and Buenos Aires than you will with the people in the hinterlands of your own country, and it's already well evolving. We're looking at an elite, a decision elite that is much more global than the rest of the world, even though they're kinsmen. This gentleman in the front, did you have a question?
Sure.
Okay.
I'll try to tease it out into a question. You know, I actually lived in Germany courtesy of the Bosch Stiftung in the early 90s and for 1 year, and then stayed on for 2 more years. And I now get back every couple of years, and I connect with old friends, and I tend to get a snapshot of German sentiment in the transatlantic relationship in kind of 2 and 3 year increments. And I remember going in probably in 2006 or 2007, and there was this deep sense of disappointment, right? That, George Bush, was the worst president ever, and the failure to build consensus about Iraq with our longstanding partners, old Europe, and then the damage to our moral authority with things like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. But it was almost a woundedness, like you're supposed to be the good guys, And there was so much hope then attached to the Obama presidency. And then, you know, and although, which yielded relatively little, and then this huge disappointment around the NSA spying and the Merkel phone bugging and some of the other phone tapping that went on. And the reaction more recently is more of anger and loss of trust.
Yeah.
I guess my thoughts are, what can we do institutionally to start rebuilding trust? And I was at a conference last week, and it's sort of like, we can't talk about the Befindlichkeit. We just need to get back to work on TTIP, which I don't think that's the answer. And I wonder if I wonder how much of the domestic U.S. reaction to the NSA revelations, and I think that at least in these kinds of audiences, a growing sense that the trade-off, you talked about the trade-off between peace and freedom. I think that in the U.S. there's been a massive trade-off between security and freedom. And I think people are starting to get fed up. And I wonder if that's part of the answer, that to sort of telegraph those domestic reaction. That I don't think this in this kind of an audience in San Francisco, you'd have a lot of support for what the NSA has been doing, and I would certainly hope that the German populace more broadly doesn't think that that the typical educated American thinks our behavior is defensible. I think Germany, in that discussion, has the moral high ground in being outraged and advancing greater privacy protection. So just
look, a brilliant question, and I share completely. I think it was the founder of Bosch, who did this quote: "You can always lose money, but you don't lose trust." Yeah, because the moment it's lost, it's lost. The problem of Europe is nothing else. Through Euro crisis, austerity, whatever trust is gone in the European Union, and we rebuild, and so drastically in the crisis years 2009 to 2011, what we lost in terms of trust to European institutions, which we built for 50 years. Yeah. It's coming very slowly back, yeah, and it comes always different. Again, then general dynamics count even more, because if you are in the generation which was born or which experienced the austerity, and your own life has been affected because you are in the 22-year-old Italian, Greek, Spanish, not going for a job, then trust is gone, and gone forever, because it probably has destroyed your life, or at least a decade for your life. Yeah. So I agree, and I think for the transatlantic relations, it's not pretty much. It's completely the same. This is probably why I'm sitting here, funded by the Robert Bosch Foundation, because the only way to rebuild this is talking, and that's why I think, and this is why I said this. Value matter. I mean, we are just discovering that value should matter, yeah? And I think, be that hormone beef or NSA sensitivities, if we could have the feeling that we can get together on a more or less same value instinct again, that would be good. Yeah, and this accounts for TTIP, hormone beef, but more importantly for NSA and spying. The moment we have the feeling that the US goes in sheer wording and the way the country behaves, and the country doesn't react to Google or has even no intention, then it starts to be difficult to build trust. Because then you have really the feeling that in societal terms we are drifting apart, which is then basically no value basis for common policy, and that's what we see. Yeah, and this is why I think François Zolto, a French psychoanalytic, once said, "Tout est langage." Everything is language. Yeah. So if we do not have the same language, and we haven't made clear whether security tops peace, tops freedom, or freedom tops security, or all these wordings, you don't get politics right. And I think this is, and we don't have the same sensitivity to privacy and private sphere. This is really bad. We don't have the same understanding of democracy, or the notion of equality in democracies, and so on and so forth. I think this is really what drives our societies apart. For instance, you were pointing to these things, but Europeans can, obviously in San Francisco, I guess, hormone beef, NSA, you're more European than, but here again is what Olaf said, yeah? If the real thing is overfly country and coastal America, and in France it's Ardèche versus Paris, then how we cope with this? what do we do with the left behinds? How does your country treat the left behinds, and how does Europe treat the rural regions, which are basically left behinds, the losers of globalization? Yeah, I'm not so sure whether every German per capita will get 500 euros out of TTIP. Yeah, but I can point to the export working people who will probably get 2,000 out of it. Yeah. So, and what do we do here? And can we shape from common policies? That would be the very interesting questions to discuss. But then we discuss societal questions. We don't discuss policy questions. Yeah, we should have a common discussion of Piketty, yes or no. Yeah, you see my point. Huh? That is I think very important, because if we don't do this, then the value erodes like the trust erodes, and then politics is not a fake, but it's hollowed out.
We have to close out. Final question, if you make it quick. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, when I talk to people in Germany and talk to people here, then it's very clear for what you said, that here people, but that in Germany people are very, very concerned about NSA, and it's understandable what you said from our history in Germany. But then here I feel that people, even in San Francisco, are pretty much indifferent, or they don't like it very much, but they would never protest, or it's not much written about. What I don't really watch or read much other European news. How big is that in other European countries? Like, how big of an issue is this in France or in the UK or other countries?
In France less, and in the UK even more less, except The Guardian, who's bringing it up. I mean, it's a British journal, yeah? With much energy, yeah?
Right.
So, I mean, this is also important, yeah? That it is The Guardian, it's not the FAZ, yeah? Although Schirmacher, who very sorry died a couple of days ago, was driving this cyber questions really through the German feuilleton and trying to sensitize you know, Schirmacher was the guy who really had a couple of series on cyber and what it does to our democracies. And he launched very interesting discussions about, you know, this pre-totalitarian and so on and so forth. Yeah? And the very fact, I do the New York Times, but I don't do much more in the US, I need to admit. I do some of your journals. I haven't been detecting a similar discussion about the pre-totalitarian structure that it could mean in terms of, you know, how does the internet affect our democracies, yeah? For the better and for the worse, yeah? What does it do to representative democracy? I agree that my kids, they couldn't care less probably about their Facebook's account, and you're not closing them down for NSA. But that is basically the citizen reactions. Yeah. On the other hand, there should be a more feuilleton-style reaction to what are we pre-shaping in terms of data, and what does it does to our society, and what does it do to our democracies. Yeah. And I'm missing this discussion in the US more than in Germany, but admittedly in France not so much, and in the UK not much neither.
Okay, I have the unenviable task of closing this out, even though I know there's more interest, but maybe we can hang around for a little bit after. Yeah. Moderator's prerogative, I'd like to close out with one question, and it's a bit unfair to you, but I trust you have such a wealth of content that you'll do this really well. It's 2035. You are happily retired, wherever Provence or Italy or wherever Germans go to retire. And you're looking at the transatlantic relationship, and what do you see? Well, how would you put a stake in the ground? What would be your vision if you say, look, this would be success in 20 years from now? What would that look like in very broad strokes? Just a minute or two.
First, I'm unfortunately not yet retired, because I only will get, I need to work until 67, so it's 2029 for me.
Okay.
Let's say 2029. I think what is really important is that together, yes or no, we get this primacy of policy back. Yeah. And it's a little bit the Piketty books thing. It's a bit it's wealth taxation, it's fortune taxation, it's banking regulation, it's harmonization. It's basically getting control of the financial sector, right? And we do this together because the sneak out argument for European financial integration is always, if we do this and the US doesn't do it, then all the capital will go to the US and vice versa. So we have a Franco-German initiative now. The BRICS are sneaking out, but this is probably the utmost, most important thing to do together, because then you would erode the European argument that if we cannot do this alone. Yeah, and from there you win back basically policy capacity. Yeah, I mean, if policy is about the collective priority about how to spend money, taxpayers' money, this is politics, yeah, then you need to have the money. And I think we are losing, and not only what we discussed today, the Ukraine question, Gazprom, is obviously that we leave that money tops the foreign policy agenda as much as money tops the domestic policy agenda. Yeah, the state is impoverished, has nothing to distribute, and so there is a problem of primacy of politics, not only as we thought in the domestic sphere, but also in the foreign policy sphere. And I think this is really a transatlantic task, because we still have the biggest market, the biggest money flows, the biggest banks. If we do this, we could probably get some hold and steering control on the global system. And I think bringing politics back to the system would be it for the. So I hope in 29, when I will retire, we have that back, and that something of the Piketty proposals. I know I'm outing myself as a boheme, left from the Middle European saying this, but I think the conceptual framework of this book is really intelligent, and if we could find a common answer to some of the policy conclusions, at least that he's sketching out, that would be a big deal.
Very good. Seems like we have a little bit of time left until then, but we have a lot of work to do. Okay, I would like to, before I do the most important thing, which is thank you, I want to thank the Robert Bosch Foundation and obviously the American Council on Germany for bringing Ulrike to us. It was such a treat, and of course I want to thank GABA and the Bay Area Council and its staff, some of whom are here tonight, for making this all possible. And most of all, I want to thank the audience for coming, and I want to thank Ulrike for endowing us with her knowledge. Thank you.